Now, the divide in Labor, it seems, over the Israel-Hamas war is wider than ever. You had Labor frontbencher Ed Husic, I don't know what he's playing at today, declaring that workers like actors and journalists, doctors, even teachers, should be able to speak out against Israel without facing any consequences. Here he is today.
People should be able to express their concern and stand with humanity and say that they have they are very concerned about what they're seeing in Gaza, and they shouldn't have to face professional retribution as a response.
Well, that's just ridiculous. They shouldn't be able to, they shouldn't do it at work, particularly teachers. If they want to do it in their private life at the weekend, good on them. Speaking of the weekend, joining me now, the host of the Outstanding Outsiders program, Rowan Dean. Great to catch up with you. Ed Husic, I mean, is he serious? We've had this Sydney Theatre Company debacle, and Husic saying, well, let them all do whatever they want to do.
Well, it's utterly ridiculous, Steve. I'm glad someone in Labor is trying to play the free speech card. It's a little bit late for Ed Husic to be pulling that one out. There are some very, very firm rules around free speech. I'm an absolute free speech advocate. But there's one very, very simple rule, and that is free speech must not be used to incite hatred. Pretty simple rule to understand. During the Hitler period, for example, there was a phrase, Juden raus. So it was like, Jews, get out, Juden raus. Now, you don't hear that phrase anymore because it would be utterly obscene for people to be using that phrase. But the equivalent of people wandering around saying, from the river to the sea, and donning themselves in the same garb and outfit as was worn by the Hamas terrorists on October 7th, is the equivalent of yelling out, from the river to the sea, is the equivalent of standing in Tel Aviv and yelling out Juden raus at the top of your voice. That is not how free speech works. From the river to the sea is a genocidal phrase calling for the genocide and annihilation of Israel. Therefore, free speech does not apply. And if Ed Husic does not understand that simple, most basic, fundamental tenet of free speech, then we've got a serious problem. The second thing I'd say, Steve, I always like to try and draw an analogy and see if the Ed Husic's or anyone's comments stack up in reverse. Flip it round. Okay, so let's just imagine, and I stress this is an analogy. I'm not saying that this actually happened, but let's imagine an analogy whereby after a horrific massacre like the Christchurch massacre several years ago in New Zealand, which was targeted at mosques, imagine the very next day when the bodies were still warm, you had people marching up and down the streets of New Zealand saying, let's end all Islamic immigration, kick all Muslims out of the country, let's get rid of this and that, and whatever. People would rightly have been appalled. It would be atrocious. Yet that is precisely what Ed Husic is advocating that people be allowed to do in Australia. When the bodies are still, when there are still hostages being held in the tunnels of Hamas, undergoing God knows what torture at the hands of the most vile criminals and terrorists who also chant from the river to the sea and all those sorts of same phrases, for anybody in Australia to think that it is appropriate to march up and down our cities or our streets or stand on theatres or classrooms or in a doctor's surgery or journalists, what a joke, and say, no, we're actually going to advocate this political issue. That is not free speech, Steve. That is an obscenity. And for Ed Husic not to understand it, I'm sorry, it says far more about Ed Husic than it does really about anyone else.
Rowan, do you suspect it might be within the Labor Party, within the federal government, that the left wants to have that message out there that they're, supportive, and they always have been, of Palestine, and so they've just nominated, okay, well, let's get Ed to do it because he's a Muslim and he comes from Western Sydney, and no one will be able to criticise him if he does it. Do you suspect it might be as simple as that, or am I insulting Ed Husic by suggesting that?
Well, Ed Husic has insulted himself. I'm sorry. He's a smart guy and he's playing the free speech card and he's been jumping up and down about this issue. The reality is Labor is beholden they believe they are beholden to the Islamic or Muslim vote in the western suburbs of Sydney. I don't think they are. I think there are plenty of Muslims who would be appalled at the outrages of Hamas and would be appalled at the excesses of ISIS and others, and who would not necessarily agree with Labor Party on the Labor Party on many issues, particularly, for example, transgender or LGBT issues. So I think the Labor Party trying to pander to the Muslim crowd, that's not the way to do it. By all means, put forward the issues, but not pandering to the basest elements of those crowds, which are the ones who stand at the Opera House chanting all sorts of obscenities about Jews. You don't pander to that crowd. You say no on a point of principle. And unless you are prepared to utterly, thoroughly, and exclusively condemn the outrages of October 7th, then you don't have the right to have free speech on the other issue unless you first of all condemn Hamas for what occurred on that day.